So thank you so much for joining us today. We're delighted to be able to launch Zaynab's fantastic new book, The International Political Economy and the Global South. I can hand the copy around. She's here today to discuss this new co-authored book on international political economy and the Global South, perspectives from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. The goal of the book was to provide an alternative or complementary reading of how IPE, which is largely derived from typically Eurocentric contexts, might learn from the experiences of the periphery. So the book asks, how has the Global South responded to the demands of the global economy? What is the meaning of sovereignty to those who've experienced colonialism and imperialism? How can the Global South claim the international when the Global North sets its norms, institutions, and practices? And the book aims to de-Westernize and decentralize the production of knowledge by introducing students to the discipline and phenomenon of international political economy with a genuinely global perspective. So we're delighted to have Associate Professor Zaynab here. She's also the interim chair at the Africa Institute at the Global Studies University in Sharjah, UAE. You've also held previous roles at NYU Abu Dhabi, Al Ahway University. I've always struggled with Arabic written in English, and the International University of Rabat. You also serve as the chair of the theory section of the International Studies Association. Your first book, which I find absolutely fascinating, and I can't wait to read it, Dignity in the Egyptian Revolution, was published by Cambridge University Press. And just before arriving to Canberra, Zaynab received the International Political Science Association's 2025 Global South Award, which has also been renamed the IPSA Margaret A. Vogt Award in honor of the late Nigerian scholar and diplomat of the African Union. And Zaynab is here with us at CAIS to further your research on global political economy and halal. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about that project at the end. I thought what we might do is Zaynab and I will have a little bit of a discussion for the first 20 or so minutes, maybe up to 30, and then the rest of the time we'll open up for questions. So for those of you on Zoom, you're welcome to unmute yourselves once we get to the question time and turn your video on. But I'll let you know when question time is going to start, and please start thinking about your questions now. So I thought to start the discussion, Zaynab, I thought I would ask you, why did you and your co-authors decide to write this book? Why did you think this was necessary?
Thank you, Jessie. I just want to take a bit of time to thank everyone, and I'm going to fail to acknowledge so many in advance, so sorry about that, but you picked me up at a late night, pouring rain day, so it was great to meet you and also see the engagement in campus. I really appreciated that. I want to also emphatically thank Karima for the opportunity of doing this fellowship, and the warm welcome. And all you also discovering Australia, so that's been great. Great for the Indo-Morocco discussions. Andrew, for indulging me as your neighbor, for sure. For the discussions, and hopefully more walks when I come back. Hopefully, so Hadi, thank you for coming, and also everyone online. Eva stopped by earlier, so thank you so much also for making me discover Canberra, and Bernie, who couldn't make it here physically. So yes, just wanted to because it's been absolutely great, and so I'm leaving soon, so I wanted to just thank you so much. So regarding how what's made us write this book, so it started actually in my first academic job, teaching international political economy in Morocco, and using a number of textbooks that in talking about international political economy had often examples from Germany, from the US, from say the Western world as these example of the global, and finding in a setting such as ours that there was a bit of a sort of a mismatch between what we are witnessing, and we had those discussions in class. So, but it triggered me to think about maybe starting a textbook that could provide examples, a discussion of international political economy with more examples from the global south. So that was the sort of first idea. Then later on, I had the opportunity to do a course collaboration with Adriana, who's my co-author here, who's from Puerto Rico, and the course was on border epistemologies, and we were talking about the example of Morocco-Spain, the Morocco-Spain border versus the Mexico-US border, and our students were also collaborating in projects, and it was lovely. So, and she is an anthropologist, and I was talking about my course in IPE, questions of research concerning the global political economy, and she was very much drawn to that. So I was like, well, that would be great if you could join the project, right? Especially because, of course, there is also this value to interdisciplinarity that sometimes criticized as a little bit missing in IR topics such as IPE. And later on came a third collaborator. So this was a colleague from a project on critical security studies based in Lebanon. And so we were talking about, again, sort of security, insecurity, and the political economy of insecurity in the region. And he does political philosophy, and he was very much interested in questions of the global political economy. So I roped him in. And lastly, Guiliano Martiniello. So this was during my time at the International University in Rabat. So he's a political ecologist, and he looked at food systems in Eastern Africa, in Rwanda, and of course that is very much also anchored in political economy. And so in our discussion, he was very interested in joining the project, and this is how we came about.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think the framing of the book is really interesting because it's not just a view of IPE from the global south, that deliberate attempt that you were just talking about to be interdisciplinary and to be transdisciplinary. Both of those things do things to IPE when you come from that perspective. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit more just about what does it do? What do you think it does to IPE specifically when you ground it in that transdisciplinary analysis, rather than the very typical approach that I was trained in, for example, in IPE, that is very based in international relations and international economics, increasingly in a positivist, but not exclusively in a positivist direction. So what do you think it does to IPE, that field, when we ground it in multidisciplinarity?
Thank you for this question, and we had the chance to chat a bit, so I'm also very much informed by your insight that were very helpful for me. So in terms of seeing the positioning of the book at this sort of in its attempt to be interdisciplinary, so its positionality at sort of the junction of different approaches to making meaning, right, in our disciplines. So ones that are very much maybe context-based, right? So in terms of also historicizing, right? For instance, the understanding of our social phenomena, right? Contextualizing versus ones that try to look at sort of universal laws, right? Sort of how we can make sense, right? And as you mentioned, right, so definitely IPE as a discipline had already started within IR to sort of invite, right, the thinking about issues of international relations beyond that state-centric view, right? So particularly with sort of the work of Susan Strange, right, the mother of IPE, as they say. So in the sense of talking about also the centrality of the market's dynamic, right, and also making the state. So not just that, so sort of more of a dialectic, right? And so there is this part, right, that has already been sort of this attempt to bring in other views, right, from other disciplines, but then it can be done in more ways. So, for instance, methodologies, right? So, non-positivist methodologies, right, help us as well. But when you also bring in, let's say, the work of a cultural anthropologist, right, that looks at how, let's say, the economies at the border, right, have made maybe some habits, say, thrive more than others among the local communities, right? So that adds again to that meaning, the making of meaning. Then you have, let's say, again, we talked about the example of, let's say, value of land, right? And when you look at, for instance, a social perspective, right, of how that can also drive decisions regarding, let's say, what we do with land, how we value land, right? That is really contributing more to our understanding in international political economy as a discipline. So just the sheer fact that it's fun to get to know these little tidbits, right? But also actually in terms of ultimately maybe informing better policy making, right? So in thinking about how, let's say, we can see, let's say, some elements of maybe grievances regarding, let's say, labor movements, right, that could inform better policies. So that's
yeah, and I think the book is structured where there's these kind of really cool anecdotal, almost big start stage chapter, each of the body chapters. And then it moves into what does this phenomena, specific historically contextualized phenomena, tell us about the broader political economy of what's happening here, and what is IPE, mainstream IPE, missing when they don't include the global south. And then the chapter typically ends, or each chapter typically ends with sort of an overview of what does this mean, and as you say, also tries to get to that point of what can we do? How can IPE become a source, not just of sort of academic information, but also a source to empower or support the empowerment of the global south, and to address some of these deep inequalities that you're covering in the book. And I thought it would be fun to talk about some of those anecdotes at the beginning of the chapters, because they're really interesting to read. And the one that I enjoyed, there's a couple, I enjoyed all of them, but I thought maybe we could start with one of the early chapters talks about this idea of value. And in economics, or even political economy, when people say the term value, it's often thought of, and this is what you cover in the book, it's a dehistoricized, it's a depoliticized term. Value means what it means in today's climate, and that it's always meant that is kind of the implication. And you really challenge that in the chapter, and it breaks down through the story of a family in the Ottoman Empire deciding whether or not to sell their land and what that would mean. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that story and unpack how has value, how should we re-understand the word value?
All right, well, so when we look, for instance, at many mainstream IPE approaches to value, so also because of the nature of the discipline, they are anchored in more of a orthodox economic approach. So of course, right, looking at rational choice theory, right? So what's in that sense specifically for value, what that means is often driven by utility, right? So if there is more utility to be extracted, right? So this means that there will be more value attached, right, to something. So for instance, when we look at, let's say, a society and we see that maybe some things, right, some work, right, so some land, some work, right, some production is more valued, so that's and would be interpreted as well, there was more inputs, right? So maybe more inputs that creates that greater utility, right? So in some in another way, sometimes it's also sort of here that I'm sort of making a caricature. So the idea that well, more value means more effort, right? So you sort of earn that value, right? So if let's say in the case of individuals, groups of individuals, a family, a wealthier family, right, sort of deserve, right, that wealth, that's prosperity because of more work, right? So one way, of course, you know, this is a nuance and there could be more to it, right? And this is some of the things that's by digging more, right, in IPE, in our IPE of understanding we can get out. So the little story was of this family. So you had the head of the family, Mikhail, right? And he was quite a wealthy merchant landowner, right? And this was during the Ottoman time, right? And he extracted value, right? If you want, from both the produce, right, coming from his orchards, right? So the land was producing, but also from actually lending money, right? So that was another way. And so that's the story. But then, like, you jump in time and see that his descendants actually lost all that fortune, right? So then comes the question, what happened, right? What happened is that there was also a change in the socioeconomic context of that part of the world, right? So actually, produce was not anymore valuable, right? So the output from the produce, right? And other lands that actually he gave away, right? Gave away because they were less valuable, they were not fertile, right? Turned out to be of those descending from those who had the poor land, actually the ones that got more value, got wealthier because they became these real estate projects, right? These villas, right? So now you have these two families looking, well, the descendants from these two branches of the family looking at each other, like, you know, like, oh, you made all that work, so, and we sort of were lazy and didn't, you know, keep our fortune, but there was more to it as well.
And I think as well, you unpack as well that it was a social decision for him to delegate some of that land to some members of the family, not to others. And I think that's another really great contribution of this book, is challenging that, you know, political economists tend to, as you say, emphasize quite a rationalist understanding of decision making. And sometimes they'll, I remember a conversation with an economist friend of mine who's just horrified by what's going on in political economy. He said, that's not economics. And so we're kind of in between the social sciences and economic theory and some of what in political economy we dress up as a science. Actual economist scientists would laugh at us. So that's why I don't really think we should call ourselves social scientists per se. But you really push at this assumption that people make human decision making is rationalist. Sometimes there's a bit of space for emotion. But what you push out in the book is that that's just one axis. And actually, there's a whole separate axis of social connection, of politics, of historical context, that also comes into decision making that's really relevant. So So I think that's a fantastic contribution of the book. There's also a really great quote in the conclusion, which says that, you know, he who throws a stone in a market will hit his relative. The Yoruba proverb. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, I'm going to try and keep it short, and we're not going to go through every chapter, but I just thought we'd just highlight a few really interesting contributions. And I thought maybe you could explain to us, what is the neoliberal diet? And what does it have to do with inequality and shifting regimes of food production?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, a neoliberal diet has depended on three foods, right? That have become sort of the dominant foods traded and the dominant elements of food systems. These three are wheat, meat, and sugar. So most of food diets around the world have, so if we think this is about McDonald's, right, that's pretty much the diet, and I mean, not only, you know, fast food, but it has, if you look at shelves in markets in many places, so these are sort of so we think about the source of carbohydrate as this one source of carbohydrates, right? Protein mostly, right? Meat. And what's interesting is how there was sort of a whole process of coming to this hegemony of the neoliberal diet, right? So what it meant was that you had big players, right? So agribusiness actors who have been benefiting, right, from this hegemony of these three foods, right? And of course, extracting so much value, right? And what it did also to a number of countries is shift their policy making regarding food, right? So from an interest in food sovereignty, right? So ensuring that we have our own food needs met, right? And preferably locally, to ensuring that our suppliers, right, are providing us with our food needs, right? So this is quite a shift. So in looking at the evolution of, and I mean, of course, thinking about global trade, right? So of course, this has benefited a lot of the magnitude of exporting for a number of countries that are big players in this neoliberal diet, right? And so what it also did was, well, create an impact on the use of land, right? So in terms of, say, what it meant for actors in agriculture, especially agrarian groups. So here, thinking about how some of the, again, decisions made were to not, again, necessarily tackle food sovereignty, but rather think about what can be traded, right? So here, I think also about cash crops, right? So specifically the example of sugarification in Eastern Africa, right? So especially to cater to this neoliberal diet, right? So you have this impact, you have also the impact on the environment, right? So here the transformation of a variety of lands to cater again to this international food system.
Yeah, I mean, I find this absolutely fascinating, and I think the chapter as well delves into what types of class inequalities that builds when you have those, and not just between global South and global North countries, although you do cover that. I mean, it's astonishing, really, and I've taught this for years in my course, that Egypt went from being a major food producer to being a net food. It's the food bowl of the Nile. And through the, systematic prioritization and incentives and an absentee sort of land holding system of elites, largely European elites in some cases, incentivized to grow cotton rather than produce food, Egypt shifted to being a net food importer. And then, as you do cover at the beginning of the chapter, there was this crisis for food production when Russia invaded Ukraine, for example, that really hit Egypt very hard and dictated, for example, Egypt's foreign policy towards the Russian-Ukrainian war. So these shifting international politics as a result of this shifts in food production is absolutely fascinating. I was also interested in it because I grew up in the US, where you talk about that the neoliberal diet is structured by class differences into basic and luxury foods. So the high quality foods or luxury foods are available for the rich who can afford fresh fruits and vegetables from world markets. And the industrial, nutritionally compromised food is accessed primarily by the poor to middle classes, contributing to deepening north-south divide. And I would say even in the global north, you see that that's the outcome. The inequalities in access to quality food, or the phenomenon of food deserts in the US is really striking. So that's absolutely fascinating.
It was also part of our thinking that actually the idea of the global south is not just territorial, right? That you have aspects of what's defined, right? This space of marginalization, right? Of precarity. That's can also be seen, right? With global north.
Yeah,
that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other chapters in the book cover, for example, stories of labor, capital movement, and changing market needs. You talk about globalization and sex work, and borders and migration, the IPE of finance and how finance can add a layer of inequality to this whole picture. You mentioned one of your co-authors specialized in security studies, so I can see that now in the security studies chapter. But I wanted to bring, because I want to open up for questions in a second, us towards the end of the book and ask you to explain a little bit that you cover in the book. In 2018, there was a march to Delhi of farmers and agricultural workers. And I wanted maybe you to tell us a little bit about what were those protests and what does it tell us about rural discontent and agricultural stagnation and IPE?
So those protests were very important to also see how there are connections in the global south. So particularly how the agrarian movement in India had been much inspired by earlier movements of in Latin America, so congregated under Via Campesina, right? In the chapter, we mentioned really quickly also that there was solidarity with farmers in Guiliano. So we wanted to also, because in every chapter we tended to be talking about an example, right, from a region, to also show that there are this solidarity across, or these opportunities of seeing interdependence in the struggles, right, across the global south. So for the case of India, so because it is obviously a major country of the global south, right, so also now the BRICS plus, right, but also because it is going through that trend of growth, right, seeking growth, seeking also exposure, greater exposure to the global economy, right? And in that sense, making sacrifices, right? So that we also tend to hear sometimes when we think about globalization, right? You have losers, you have winners and losers. That's how, it's just you have to catch up, right? So in that sense, often you have the losers that are sort of the result of policy choices that have been made and that have made their ability to exist, right, economically very, very difficult. So in the case of specifically the farmers and a country that's much depending on agrarian production as well. So we have seen that sort of push towards a change in land ownership, right? And also in terms of the concentration of production, so in terms of land use. And this means that, some of the farmers have to just deal with that, right? So again, in terms of how it's sold, so the idea is that, well, this is to ensure that we have growth, right? That we have also ensure that we have our food security, right? But the stance, right, that has been coming from the struggle of these movements has shown that there is an ability to resist, right, this trend. So there have been some concessions to a certain extent, and also the idea of given an alternative, right, is something that can make also sort of this trend, maybe change a bit or take different directions, right? So in terms of, let's say, specifically arguing for food sovereignty, right? So, and this has been a bit of the work of these groups.
Yeah, and you're really seeing that. I mean, we're seeing that in our own field of the least increasing discussion of food sovereignty as well. I'm going to ask my last question and then open up for questions from the discussion. So if you're on Zoom, you can either unmute yourself in a second, or if you like, you can type your question into the chat now, and then I'll read it out as soon as Zaynab has responded to this final question, which is that ultimately, I think there's a tension sometimes between the IPE has this sort of universal rules of how politics works and how societies function, etc. And I think here at CAIS, for example, we tend to reject some of that, say, well, context is really important here. And I note that in each of your chapters, you start with a specific anecdote from a particular place or a particular time, for example. But you also work in cross-regional comparisons into every chapter. So I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a bit about how the book re-universalizes IPE, or you're thinking about that from the perspective of the Global South rather than from the Eurocentric kind of mainstream analysis that, is dominant.
Again, I was very much inspired by our conversation earlier on, because you're asking also how a look at the Global South informs the Global North, right? So in looking at some of, let's say, the peculiarities of what is more at stake in the Global South, right? So for instance, thinking about how, let's say, the question of sovereignty, right, in the decision making is problematic in a number of cases in the Global South, right? So if you think, for instance, about let's say migration policies, right, how they can be driven by securitarian approaches versus ones about the welfare and integration, right? And you have, to a certain extent, this dichotomy, right? So in that sense, that's why it's important to look at different contexts, right? But it doesn't mean that these different contexts cannot also change under different circumstances, right? So sometimes the security, right, securitarian question can take more space, right? Even in a context where, let's say, integration and welfare have been dominant, right? So sort of seeing how there are these sort of different combinations, right, of elements that make, again, meaning, and that works in sort of universalizing, as you say, our thinking about also specifically IPE and the discipline of within the discipline of international relations, right? How it's also telling us something about the interdependence, right, between different states, between different communities, right? And I think we talked about also this idea of how when we look at different disciplines, right, especially anthropology, right, also thinking about philosophy, we're enriching our understanding of the global economy, right, this policy making that goes with it. So we're sort of saying that we're bringing the social back, right? So this idea of bringing the social back. But sometimes in other disciplines, right, you also need to, let's say, bring something else back, let's say the state back, right? If you look at, let's say, so we've been working on a piece with a colleague, and he's a sociologist, and on sort of migration policies between Morocco and Spain, and we've been actually thinking about how it's specifically the cooperation between the countries is often sort of argued for as this example of cooperation and also sort of attempt to liberalize, right? Also mobility or attempts at least, right? But that's so you have that sort of idea, right? But in reality, in practice, there is something else happening, right? And it's actually see that's the need to look at how the state is instrumentalizing a language of liberal right movements, but more for very strategic interests, right? So in that sense, right, the analysis also needs to look back at more at the state, right, and what the state is doing. So it's important to like keep that sort of multiple lenses, right, in studying a variety of topics, and that was a bit, the message you wanted to convey.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm opening up for questions now, and then I think in the last little bit, I'm going to ask you to comment on your current research project that you're here in CAIS for. So if we go first to online, does anyone online want to, you can unmute yourself and turn your video on. If you'd like to ask a question, or Karima, would you like to
I'd
come
like
in?
to ask a question. Thank you so much.
Karima, and then Eva will go to online.
Okay. Well, we can start with Eva.
Okay. There's always a pause.
Yeah, Eva, go ahead.
Online. Yeah, Eva.
Eva, are you there?
Yeah, thank you so much for a really wonderful book talk. And congratulations, Zainab, on your many remarkable achievements. Following on from what Jessie mentioned about value, and I was just wondering, how does the concept of value in this book shape or perhaps obscure or redistribute power across the varied domains explored in this book, from food regime, labor, and sex work to finance and many more? And what does this reveal about whose knowledge and experience are recognized perhaps in the international political economy in relation to the value that I mentioned before?
Thank you, Eva. That's a fantastic question. That's I feel like needs a whole other book. But it's yeah, I mean, it's testament to how you think. It's so I mean, yeah, it's so for us, how we dealt with it. So in terms of how we determined value, right, in that specific discussion of land, was through a variety of examples. So we started by looking at the idea that right value is also well a power relation, right? So in terms of looking at both what knowledge has been produced about the defining of the value, but also what it had produced materially in terms of making value, right? So so in terms of markets, right? For let's say our current context, right? So we have a understanding of value as well, the expression of utility, right? So here also a vision that's coming from a Western tradition, right? If we think also about Western philosophy, right? And translating into profits, right? Specifically in the case of markets, right? But then you have, of course, other visions of value, right? So value as maybe also relating to ethics, right? So looking at moral value, right? But that's almost a in terms of practicality, right? It seems that it's outside of the scope of, let's say, political economy discussions, right? So we talked about mostly how there had been these discussions in the discipline, right? So looking at value, a rationalist sort of approach. But then what we've been trying to do is trying to look at examples where actually that sort of mainstream idea, dominant idea of value is challenged by maybe circumstances, right? Sort of contexts. So for instance, the decision to, let's say, give away, right, something valuable, right? Maybe not because we're getting profit out of it, but because it's going to get us, let's say, social capital, right? Right, social, also maybe an ethical, right, also approach to thinking about value, right? Maybe that was also part of it. So and the conclusion had been for us to then see that there is much more sort of flexibility in thinking about what is value, right? So of course there is dominance, right? So if we think about let's say how pricing, right, has almost started to equate value, though it's not the same thing, but pricing, right? And let's say in economics discussions about, you know, how can we become better at pricing things, right? So yes, there is this way of understanding value, right? But it's also very interesting to try and look at a variety of contexts, communities, right? And understand what comes into play in making value.
Yeah, thank you. And I think actually the second part of Eva's question, what does this reveal about whose knowledge is influential in IPE? I was also really struck by, you addressed that really directly right in the introduction. You sort of say, and I'm kind of almost quoting, that it's mostly academic bodies that are presented as the places where IPE scholarship is originating. But that's really limiting because such bodies are not necessarily influential to the practice of local policy making, and that it might actually be that's why your book has this practical element of trying to look at where we can seek ways to change IPE to increase equity and well-being. So I think that's speaking directly to what Eva's treatment.
Yeah, thank you. That was genuinely mesmerizing. We could have listened to you going on for hours. Thank you so much, Zaynab, and congratulations on the book and the award. So my question was really to try and historicize it a bit, this discussion, to see how far it goes back in history and tackle the question of capitalism as a form of European kind of capitalism, because there were other global economies well before the West, but the capitalist system, the unbridled search for profits and looking for resources, it's, kind of 20th century, early 20th century phenomena, and how it was very much intertwined with colonialism, the search for other land and resources, and how the global South was at the receiving end of those expansionist, colonialist projects that, in fact, had long-lasting impact on their local economy. So if I'm thinking, for example, in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, that the pearl industry was a very small, localized industry. Then upon the arrival of the British and French and other empires, it became, and the entry of the region into the global economy, it becomes a global industry that has, in fact, accelerated the acquisition of slaves from East Africa to kind of cater for the need of the expanding industry. The same with the date industry, when it, when the US started buying the dates from the region. I was thinking the same about Egypt, the introduction of cotton, and in North Africa, where we come from, in Algeria, Morocco, the introduction of wine industry, all sorts of industry that were really alien to the land, the environment, and the economies of this region. And I'm just intrigued how, with the coming of the post-colonial state, there was never a disjoint. In fact, there was kind of a colluding of the local elite who took power with these foreign investors, power, state, to continue with the same model, and there was never a kind of going back. And that has created a lot of problems. Particularly, I'm intrigued by the environmental issues and the environmental damages that has created. For example, the causing, particularly in Morocco, the scarcity of water, the loss of water, drought, the destruction to the environment. So I was wondering, to what extent these go back to history, kind of net our post-colonial global South not being able to decolonize economically and politically. How do you perceive those links and the damages that has caused to environment? Because I'm thinking of Egypt and the war about water, and what's happening in Morocco as well, as you said, the changing nature of from small farming to mass farming that is creating more havoc.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was a long,
thank you.
question.
Yeah.
Apologies.
No, and and it's great that's in there. I hear also your research on in the Gulf and the connection between pearl diving, slavery, right? Also this sort of the embedding of Gulf communities in that's kind of economy, global economy. Definitely, looking back at history is very important. And so here there is, so that's why sometimes it can be hard to really genuinely, practically be as interdisciplinary and multidimensional as possible because of our just abilities, but also how that actually is necessary to get people all better meet, right? So, in the case of the region, right? So, we say, right, post-colonial, right? So obviously there is a controversy about even saying that, right? So some people talk about the incomplete decolonization, right? The part of what had been sort of happening was that there were these systems of production, right, that came with systems of dispossession, right? So it's sort of they come in hands, right? And so what it meant, right, was that there to cater to these systems of production, right? Especially sometimes that are out of territory, right? So we're extracting, right? So what's important is to think about actually exactly that there are these connections, right, between, let's say, the history of the political systems, right, the sort of political entities involved, right, in these regions, and what's happening in the markets, in the economy, right? So Jessie was mentioning how there was this sort of attempt to also say that's let's say discipline, IPE specifically, how it's dealt with is quite siloed, right? So it's siloed, particularly under these organizations, right? So for instance, the International Studies Association, right? And that's a big one, and like everyone is trying very much to emulate how they are approaching the discipline, right? But what's missing is, well, can we also look at what policymakers are doing, right? Because that's actually for IPE in practice, right? And how can we actually also make meaning out of that, right? In the concluding sort of remarks we made, we were also talking about this idea, this attempt in academia to decolonize, right? So we talk about decolonizing education, right? But it's often sort of seen as like just this organ, right? So there is the higher education system, and that's what needs to. But where is it embedded? It's also embedded within the politics, right? So actually, to really be able to do that, you need to also push, right, towards, let's say, discussing how the political system has been reproducing, and especially if we think, for instance, about the so-called post-colonial state, right? How the post-colonial state had been branded as liberating, right? Revolution, changing, when it was in some aspect reproducing, right? Some of let's say these food systems, right? Yeah, so that's
Thank you.
thank you. And yeah, I just wanted to also like highlight that point on particularly regions. So thinking, for instance, about North Africa, right? From Egypt to Morocco, that have become so food insecure, right?
Yeah.
So food dependence, and Egypt, I think, ranking as the largest consumer of bread in the world, right? So having those also examples where you also see policy making of programs like Maroc Vert, the Green Morocco, right? That's supposed to be doing, you know, a revolution, right, in terms of let's say the more efficient farming, right? But it has been extremely depleting water resources that are, and the same goes for Egypt, right? So there was this article that I saw not long ago that was like, so in North Africa, we're selling, I don't know, water dependent avocados and strawberries and raspberries, right? To also embedded in the regional integration of the region, so to Gulf countries, right? But being also food insecure, right?
Yeah, you gave a really good example of that in the book that I happened to have pasted the quote in my notes. So you talked about how Saudi Arabia leased land in Ethiopia for the production of rice, wheat, and barley at the same time as the World Food Programme was spending 116 million US dollars for the provision of food aid to Ethiopians who were threatened by hunger and malnutrition. And so you capture, I think, really well this dichotomy between overabundance of low calorie or high calorie but low nutritional quality food, with at the same time, you know, too much food and not enough food are the outcomes of this system. We're a little over time. I want to point out to the people on Zoom that I put the, I didn't want to block your view of Zaynab, but I'm going to quickly share the screen so that you can see where you can buy Zaynab's book. It's here on the screen. And I just want to invite another round of questions. It could be our final round from anyone on Zoom, but also anyone here in the room. And I thought we might take 2 or 3 questions and then throw them all at you at the same time. Okay. Anyone on Zoom, you're welcome to unmute yourselves and just jump in.
Just on this matter of I think of the South Pacific, you've been talking about North Africa and the Gulf, but the South Pacific is a really graphic example of beginning with what they call taste transfer for the appetites of people to these global foods, as you were talking about. And I think there have been quite a few studies done, not only the economic consequences because they become food dependent, of course, but also the health consequences, soaring diabetes rates, lowering. So the catastrophic effects of this kind of internationalisation of their food consumption just be really interesting example. And the way in which countries have leveraged that in order to establish a hegemony over those South Pacific states.
Yeah, and Alam has a question as well online.
Thank you so much, guys, for this protection. Thank you, Jessie. Thank you, Dr. Prof. Zaynab again. As is my Alam. My camera has issues, so you just hear me, but you don't see me. I don't have a direct question to the book, but I'm looking forward to read it. And again, thank you so much for your time, for your collaboration. Looking forward to see you again and again. Thank you guys for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions here in the room?
No, I think I'll keep my questions to I kind of got like a little different formulation of maybe Karima's question, different variant of it. So I didn't want to take the time of anyone's questions, but also I think all the time. So happy to
talk after. Well, maybe I'll add the one final question, which is that I would like to get a quick one.
This one, I'm just thinking of these phenomena like so hydroponic farming and things like this are happening in Saudi Arabia now. Fish farming, I've heard about as well recently. You know, what kind of audience are these? You know, what kind of what's the driver behind this kind of thing? It seems again something that's appealing to an audience that's not regional, it's somehow abroad. I don't know what the kind of economic value ultimately is there. That's just a general question I have.
All right, we'll do that. And the final question I'll throw to you is just to give us a little brief overview of your current research project, as also something that we can continue to discuss with you later.
Thank you. I'm not sure about the case of Saudi Arabia, but in the UAE where I'm based, I've seen these like farms, like, you know, in the middle of the desert and, you know, like lush fields. And you go to the supermarket and you see like proudly made in UAE, like as well.
I just wonder about what the driver there is. So the government's proud of that.
Yeah.
It's presented to media. I mean, Western media will write about it. So something that's involved in that.
But I think it's also, you know, like encouraging as part of that growth, right? Diversifying, right, the economy, investing locally, right? So it's consumed, right? So it's even in the language actually of the minister. So the minister of in charge of food policy, like talks specifically about food security, and we're making the UAE, right? That's I think also with the sort of idea that they have the capacity, even though it's also very sort of resource intensive, right? That we have the capacity to meet our needs, right? To make, right, locally, despite the difficulties, right? The environmental difficulties or limitations, right? So it's almost like, you know, there in nature.
It's more performative. It's like having sports that are not from the country, and you have now snooker in Saudi Arabia, you have tennis in Saudi Arabia, you have every sport you can imagine, but it's all kind of globally performative rather than something that's sort of sustainable or emerging from the culture and society. That's, I just wonder if there's something similar happening in some of these industries that are happening in food.
But in the case of Qatar, is really like it's the outcome of the embargo, you know, because they now have cows that they brought
In Oman,
to produce
in Oman,
milk in Qatar, because they really freaked out. That was an episode that caused the kind of the drive for food security, because if we are embargoed, we can't access it. So
Oh no, and you're completely right about Qatar. In Oman has got a different driver, which is that it's they've been trying to produce local fruits and vegetables, but there's not been preferenced by consumers. And so instead consumers have been choosing the more beautiful looking imported food. But that's, you know, part of Oman's climate adaptation policy is to get people to value the Omani grown food so that they don't need to rely so much on these imported foods, and to actually running campaigns to get people to buy local as sort of a nationalist endeavor. But it's about their climate adaptation policy. And they're also trying to run this new investment program in some of the key agricultural lands in Oman about trying to improve the conditions so that the food can look a little bit better, and a little bit less heat struck, and to make it more attractive and then build up the industry. Sorry, and you have Greg's question.
Yes, sorry. Actually the online languages are fantastic. We get them in the UAE.
There's a comment, and it's not necessarily a question, but so I don't feel obliged to respond.
But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the link with so this internationalization, right, of food systems and the prevalence of disease and I mean, that's something that's we can also see, for instance, in the case of Egypt, particularly being such a large consumer, and we're not far behind Morocco. Yeah, also with diabetes as well, especially because like in the case of Morocco, so we even have this word for flour that is force. So we say force. This type of the very refined flour, and force because it came from the military base, the American military base. So yeah, so it's you know, it's the Air Force, right? So we say force for flour, and and actually that's really changed how bread has been made, right? So bread used to be made
at home,
at home with a variety of grains, so not necessarily wheat, right? And now it's just, you know, very refined white flour, and it's the force because it's also subsidized, right? And that was part of an agreement actually with the US government to provide us with the refined wheat that's sort of, you know, entered the diets, right? And it was also because it was at a lower cost for the government, right? So there was sort of this deal, right? So and actually, I mean, so my next project, and to go back to your question regarding this project on the political economy of the Hada. So I'm trying to take some of what we have learned together, right, from this book to how we can approach looking at the halal expansion and specifically certification, right? That certification, because it's interesting in terms of what it's doing to actually the approach to consumption, right? So people looking at labels, seeking labels, right? Well, the business, the industry that has also arose, right? So you have now these HCBs, halal certification bodies, right? In some countries, they must be recognized by the state, in others, no, right? What it means in terms of trust of consumers, right? What it also means in terms of a set of policies, such as, for instance, here, and it's been good to be here in Australia because it's one of the largest exporters of halal meat. So either live or processed, and also looking, for instance, at all the discussion about animal welfare, right? So here policies regarding that and how they've been driven so by a concern for halal labeling, right? So yeah, that's it's been great to be here, I've been also to Indonesia, where it's one of the largest halal markets, and again also looking at all the potential, right? So right now, actually in most Muslim countries, it's really insignificant how much of the Islamic economy or it is its share, right? So there is all this potential growth that's sought after. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you so much for the book, and
Thanks.
you have the QR code for us to buy a copy.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.